Chapter 4 of Memoirs Illustrating the History of Jacobinism by Barruel. First means of the conspirators, the Encyclopedia. To crush the wrench in the sense of Voltaire, or to attain destruction of the altars of that God whose worship had been taught by the apostles, nothing less could suffice than the total subjugation of the public opinion and the annihilation of the faith of all Christian nations. To exacerbate it by force was above the strength of the rising coalition. Fourth was only to be restored to when by a revolution in all religious ideas things had been brought to that state in which our Jacobin legislators found them, or when by infidelity the courts, the senates, the armies, in short, men of all descriptions, had been gained over to a blind confidence in a submission to their sophistry. Indeed, the necessary growth of impiety and corruption supposed too long a period for Frederick or Voltaire ever to flatter themselves with the hope of seeing it. It was then too early for them to grasp the falchion of the butchering Jacobin, nor much we expect in the following pages to read of guillotines or forced requisitions in battle array against the altars of Christianity. In the beginning, their intrigues are hidden and silent, slow and tortuous, but more insidious from their secrecy, more certain from their slowness. The public opinion was to perish, as it were, by an in initiation before they dared lay the axe to the altar. This mode of proceeding, we find, is perfectly understood by Frederick when he writes to Voltaire that to undermine the edifice in silence is to oblige it to fall of itself, and still better understood by D'Alembert when upbraiding Voltaire with being too hasty. He says, "If mankind grow enlightened, it is because we have used the caution to enlighten them by degrees." Convinced of the necessity of this gradation, D'Alembert bethought himself of the encyclopedia as the grand means of philosophizing mankind and of crushing the wrench. His project is no sooner conceived than it is enthusiastically adopted by Diderot and Voltaire, more than once animated by their drooping courage by his constant attention to the undertaking. To judge of what prodigious importance the success of this famous dictionary was to conspiring chiefs, we must be acquainted with its plan, the method of its execution, and how it was to become the infallible agent of infidelity, and its most powerful weapon in perverting the public opinion and overturning all the principles of Christianity. The encyclopedia is at first ushered into the world as a aggregate, the complete treasure of all human arts and sciences of religion, divinity, physics, history, geography, astronomy, and commerce. In a word, of whatever can constitute a science of poetry, oratory, grammar, painting, architecture, manufactures, and whatever can be the objects of useful or pleasing arts. This great work was to comprehend the very minutiae of different trades, from the manufacturer to the laborer. It was to be of itself an immense library, and to supply the place of one. It was to be the work of scientific men, the most profound in every branch that France could produce. The discourse in which it was announced by D'Alembert to all Europe was written with so much art and had been so profoundly meditated and so nicely weighed, the concatenation of the sciences and the progress of the human mind appeared so properly delineated when whatever he had borrowed from Bacon or Chambers on the filiation of ideas so completely disguised. In short, the plagiary sophister had so perfectly decked himself in the plumage of others that the prospectus of the encyclopedia was looked upon as a masterpiece, and its author, of course, considered the most proper person to preside over so stupendous a work. Much were their mighty promises, but these were never intended to be fulfilled, while on the other side they had their secret object which they were determined to accomplish. This was to convert the encyclopedia into a vast emporium of all these sophisms, error, or calumnies which had ever been invented against religion, from the first schools of impiety to the day of their enterprise, and these were to be so artfully concealed that the reader should insensibly imbibe the poison without the least suspicion. To pervert discovery, the error was never to be found where it might be supposed. Religion was not only to be respected, but even advocated in all direct discussions, though sometimes the discussion is so handled that the objection they seem to refute is more forcibly impressed on the mind of the reader, the more to impose on the unthinking. D'Alembert and Diderot artfully engaged several men of unblemished character to undertake in this vast and laborious undertaking. Such was Mr. Jean Cour, a man of great learning and probity, who was furnished a number of articles to the encyclopedia. His name alone might have been thought a sufficient guarantee against all the art and perfidy of its principles, and it was further declared that all points of religion were to be discussed by divines well known for their learning and orthodoxy. All this might have been true, and yet the work only proved the more perfidious. From D'Alembert and Diderot had reserved to themselves a threefold resource for forwarding the anti-Christian conspiracy. Their first resource was the insinuating error and infidelity into those articles that might be deemed the least suspectable of them, such, for example, as history or natural philosophy, and even into chemistry and ge- geography, where such dangers could not have been surmised. The second was that of references, a precious art by which, after having placed some religious truth under the reader's eyes, he is tempted to seek further information in the articles of a quite different cast. Sometimes the mere reference was an epigram or a sarcasm that they would, for instance, after having treated a religious subject with all possible respect, simply add, see the art, prejudice, or superstition, or fanaticism. Lastly, when our referring sophisters feared this shift could not avail them, they would not hesitate at altering and falsifying the discussion of a virtuous co-operator, or at adding an article of their own, whose apparent object was to defend, while its real intention was to refute what had already been written on the subject. In fine, impiety was to be sufficiently veiled to make it attractive, but at that same time to leave place for excuse and subterfuge. This was the particular art of our barking sophister D'Alembert. Diderot, more daring, was at first countenanced in the mad flights of his impiety, but in cooler moments his articles were to be revised. He was then to add some apparent restriction in favor of religion, some of those high-sounding and reverential words, but which left the whole of the impiety to subsist. If he was above that care, D'Alembert, as supervisor general, took it upon himself. Peculiar care was to be taken in the compiling of the first volumes, lest the clergy, those men of prejudice, as they were called, should take the alarm. As they proceeded in the work, they were to grow more bold, and if circumstances did not favor them, nor allow them to say all they wished to say, they were to resort to supplements and to foreign editions, which would at the same time render this dangerous work more common and less costly to generality of readers. The encyclopedia, perpetually recommended and cried up by the adepts, was to be a standing book in all libraries, incessantly that the learned was to be converted into the anti-Christian world. If this project was well conceived, it was impossible to see one more faithfully executed. It is now our duty to lay before the reader the proofs, first as to the fact, secondly as to the intention. For the first it will be sufficient to cast the eye on the divers article of this immense collection, especially where the principal tenets of Christianity, or even of natural religion, are treated, and to follow them through the divers references which the sophisters have prepared for the reader. We shall find the existence of God, free agency, and the spirituality of the soul treated in the style of a Christian philosopher, but a vide démonstration or vide corruption will be added to pervert all that had been said, and the article to which D'Alembert and Diderot more particularly refer the reader are exactly those where the doctrine of the sceptic or the Spinozist, of the fatalist or the materialist is chiefly inculcated. See notes at the end of the chapter. This cunning would not escape those authors who wrote in the defense of religion, but Voltaire, resorting to calumny in order to defend their encyclopedia, would present these authors as enemies of the state and bad citizens. Such, indeed, were his usual weapons, and had he perfectly succeeded in deceiving people, it would have been sufficiently to have examined his confidential correspondence with the very authors of the work, to be convinced of the wickedness of their intentions. At 100 leagues from Paris, and not thwarted by the obstacles which D'Alembert had to combat, he often complains that the attacks are not sufficiently direct. He is often ruffled by certain restrictions usual to D'Alembert, and at length in breaks out on those which are visible in the article Bayle. D'Alembert answers, "This is an ideal quarrel indeed on Bayle's dictionary. In the first place, I do not say, happy would it have been had he shown more reverence to religion and morality. My phrase is much more modest, and beside, in a cursed country like this, where we are writing, who does not know that such sentences are but a mere matter of form, and only a cloak to the truth additionally conveyed? Everyone is aware of that." During the time that Voltaire was busied with the articles he so frequently sent to D'Alembert for the encyclopedia, he often complained of his shackles, and was unable to dissemble how much he desired to attack religion openly. He writes, "All that I am told about the articles of divinity and metaphysics grieves me to the heart. Oh, how cruel it is to print the very reverse of what one thinks." But d'Alembert, more adroit, sensible of the necessity of these palliatives, lest he should be looked upon as a madman by those whom he wished to convert, foresaw the day when he could triumphantly answer, "If mankind is so much enlightened today, it is only because we have used the precaution, or had the good fortune, to enlighten them by degrees." When Voltaire had sent certain violent articles under the name of the priest of Lausanne, d'Alembert would immediately write, "We shall always receive with gratitude whatever comes from the same hands. We only pray our heretic to draw in his claws a little, as in certain places he has shown his fangs a little too much. This is a time for stepping back to make the better leap." And to show that he never lost sight of his maxim, he answers Voltaire's animadversions in the article Hell. Without doubt, we have several wretched articles in our Divinity and Metaphysics, but with divines for censors and a privilege, I defy you to make them better. There are articles less exposed where all is set to rights again. Can there be a doubt left of the precise and determined intention of the encyclopedists when Voltaire exhorts d'Alembert to snatch the moment whilst the intention of government is drawn off by other concerns? During this war with Parliament and the bishops, the philosophers will have fine play. You have a fair opportunity of filling the encyclopedia with those truths that we should not have dared utter 20 years ago. Or when he writes to Damiville, "I can be interested by a good dramatic performance, but could be far more pleased with a good philosophical work that should forever crush the wrench. I place all my hopes in the encyclopedia." After such an avowal, it would be useless to seek further proof of this immense compilation being no other than the grand arsenal for all their sophisticated arms against religion. Diderot, more open even in his ambush, reluctantly employed cunning. He does not hide how much he wished boldly to insert his principles, and those principles are explained when he writes, "The age of Louis XIV only produced two men worthy of cooperating to the encyclopedia, and these two men were Perrault and Boindin. The merits of the latter are more conspicuous than of the former." Boindin, born in 1676, had lately died a reputed atheist, and had been refused Christian burial. The notoriety of his principles had shut the French Academy against him, and with such titles he could not have failed being a worthy cooperator. Such then the object, such the intention of the conspiring authors, we see by their own confession that they did not wish to compile for science, but to compile for science, but for infidelity. That is, that it was not the advancement of arts they sought, but to seize the moment when the intention of the ruling authorities was drawn off to propagate their impious calumnies against religion. They hypocritically uttered some few religious truths, and praised the contrary of that of what they believed on Christianity, but only in the better to cover the sophisms which they printed against it. In spite of all their art, however, men zealous for religion forcibly opposed the work. The Dauphin, in particular, obtained a temporary suspension of it, and various were the obstacles encountered by its authors. D'Alembert, wearied, had nearly forsaken it when Voltaire, sensible of the importance of this first tool of the conspiracy, roused his drooping courage. He, far from abating, rather redoubled his efforts for asking for and incessantly sending fresh articles. He would extol perseverance. He would show D'Alembert and Diderot the ignominy and shame redounding to their opponents. He would urge them, conjure them by their friendship or in the name of philosophy to overcome their disgust and not to be foiled in so glorious an undertaking. At length the encyclopedia was brought to a conclusion, and it made its appearance under the sanction of a public privilege. Triumphed in their first step, the conspirators saw in it but the forerunner of their future successes against religion. That no doubts may exist as to the particular drift in this compilation, the reader must be made acquainted with the co-opters chosen by D'Alembert and Diderot, especially for the religious part. Their first divine was Raynal, a man just expelled from the order of the Jesuits on account of his impiety, that very thing which constituted his chief and strongest recommendation to D'Alembert. Everyone, unfortunately, knows how well he verified the judgment of his former brethren by the atrocious declamations against Christianity, but few are acquainted with the anecdote of his expulsion from among the co-operators, and that connects his story with that of another divine who, without being impious himself, had been unfortunately drawn into the company of the sophisters. This was the Abbé Yvon, an old metaphysician, but an inoffensive and upright man, often in extreme indignance, and living by his pen when he thought he could do it with decency. In the simplicity of his heart, he had written the defense of the Abbé de Parade. I have heard him assert that not a single error could be found in that work, and on the first argument give up the points. With the same simplicity, I have heard him relate by what means he had cooperated in the encyclopedia. I was in want of money, said he. Raynal met me and persuaded me to write a few articles, promising me a good reward. I acceded, and when my work was delivered at Raynal's study, I received 25 louis d'or. Thinking myself very well paid, I imparted my good fortune to one of the booksellers employed for the encyclopedia, who seemed much surprised that the articles furnished by Raynal should not be his own. He was furious at the trick he suspected. A few days later, after this, I was sent for to the office, and Raynal, who had received 1,000 crowns for his pretended work, was obliged to refund me the 100 louis d'or he had kept for himself. This anecdote will not surprise those who are acquainted with Raynal's plagiary talents. His impiety was not indeed sufficient to prevent his dismission, but it preserved him with the pale of the fraternal embrace. I must add that the articles on God and on the soul furnished by the Abbé Yvon are exactly those grieved Voltaire to the heart, and for which D'Alembert and Diderot were obliged to have recourse to their art of references. The third divine, or as D'Alembert styles him, the second, for he never dared mention Yvon to Voltaire, was the Abbé de Parade, obliged to fly to Prussia for an attempt to impose on the Sorbonne by advancing his own impious propositions as those of religion. It was the cunning of this thesis which had misled the Abbé Yvon, but being soon discovered, the Parliament took it up. The author, nevertheless, was put under the protection of the king by Prussia, by Voltaire and d'Alembert. We also owe it to the memory of the Abbé de Parade to relate what his protectors would willingly conceal, that 3 years afterwards he publicly retracted all his errors in a declaration signed 6th of April 1754, bewailing his intimacy with the sophisters, adding that one life could not suffice to bewail his past conduct. He died in 1782. Another of their divines was the Abbé Morellet, a man dear to Voltaire and to d'Alembert, who, playing on his name, called him the Abbé Morellet Bitem, because under pretense of attacking the Inquisition, he had fallen on bitten the church with all his might. Were we to enumerate the lay writers who cooperated in this work, we should find far worse than these divines, but we will only mention the celebrated Dumarzius, a man so infamous that the public authorities were obliged to interfere and destroy a school he had formed solely to imbue his pupils with the venom of his impiety. This unfortunate man also retracted his errors, but not till he lay on his deathbed. The choice of this man's pen shows the kind of cooperators which d'Alembert sought. Far be it from me to confound in this class such men as M.M. de Mormeil or Ch4, practically the latter to whom, as we have already said, they were indebted for many articles. The only reproach that can attach to him is that he should have continued his labors after he either saw or should have seen the drifts of the vast compilation, wherein, intermixed with his toils, lay all the sophisms and calumnies impiety could invent. Excepting these two men, we may comprehend nearly all the rest of the encyclopedian writers in the following picture, drawn by Diderot himself. All that detestable crew, who, though perfectly ignorant, valued themselves on knowing everything, who, seeking to distinguish themselves by that vexation universality to which they pretended, fell upon everything, jumped and spoiled all, and converted this pretended digest of science into a gulf, or rather a sort of rag baskets where they promiscuously threw everything half examined, ill digested, good, bad, and indifferent, but always incoherent. What a precious avowal as to the intrinsic merits of their work, especially after what he says as to their views, in describing the pains that they had taken, the vexation it had caused them, and the art it had required to insinuate that they dared not openly write against prejudices, religion, in order to overthrow them without being perceived. But all these follies and rag dealers contributed to the bulk and accelerated the appearance of the volumes, the chief carefully inserting in each volume that could promote the grand object. Being at length terminated, all the trumpets sounded, and the journals of the party teemed with the praises of this literary achievements. They learned themselves were duped. Everyone would have an encyclopedia, numerous worthy editions of all sizes and prices, but in every successive one, under the pretense of correction, greater boldness was assumed. About the time when the anti-Christian revolution was nearly accomplished, appeared Encyclopedia par ordre de matière. When it was first undertaken, some deference was still paid to religion. A man of eminent merit, Mr. Bergier, a canon of Paris, thought it incumbent on him to yield to the pressing solicitations of his friends, lest the parts treating on religion should fall into the hands of its greatest enemies. That was easy to foresee came to pass. The name of a man who had combated the impious work of a Voltaire or a Rousseau naturally served as a cloak to this new digest, styled the Encyclopedia Methodized. This was on the eve of the French Revolution, so that the petty infidels charged with the work observed no farther bounds with the regard to religion. This new work is more completely impious than the former, notwithstanding some excellent tracts of Mr. Bergier and of some others, and thus the sophisters of the day perfected the first tool of the anti-Christian conspirators. Note to Chapter 4, page 34, Devices of the Encyclopedia. Look for the article God, Geneva edition, and you will find very sound notions together with the direct physical and metaphysical demonstrations of his existence. And indeed, under such an article, it would have been too bold to have broached anything even bordering on atheism, Spinozism, and Epicurism. But the reader is referred to the article Demonstration, and where all the physical and metaphysical cogent arguments for the existence of God disappear. We are there taught that all direct demonstrations suppose the idea of infinitude, and that such an idea cannot be very clear neither to the materialist or the metaphysician. This, in a word, destroys all confidence the reader had placed in the proofs adduced of the existence of God. There again, they are pleased to tell you that a single insect, in the eyes of a philosopher, more forcibly proves the existence of a God than all the metaphysical arguments whatsoever. But you are then referred to corruption, where you learn how caution must be of asserting in a positive manner that corruption can never beget animated bodies, that such a production of animated bodies by corruption seems to be countenanced by daily experiments, and that it is precisely from these experiments that the atheists conclude the existence of God to be unnecessary, either for the creation of man or animals. Prepossessed by these references against the existence of God, let the reader turn to the articles of Encyclopedia and Epicurism. In the former, he will be told that there is no being in nature that can be called the first or last, and that the machine, infinite in every way, must be necessary be the deity. In the latter, the atom is to be the deity. It will be the primary cause of all things, by whom and of whom everything is active, essentially of itself, alone, unalterable, alone, eternal, alone, immutable. And thus the reader will be insensibly led from the God, the gospel, to the heathenish fictions of an Epicurism or Spinoza. The same cunning is to be found in the article of the soul. When the sophisters treat directly of the essence, they give the ordinary proofs of its spirituality and of its immorality. They will even add in the article brutes that the soul cannot be supposed material, nor can the brute be reduced to the quality of a mere machine without running the hazard of making man an automaton. And under natural law, we read that if the determination of man, even his oscillations, arise from anything material and extraneous to his soul, there will be neither good nor evil, neither just nor unjust, neither obligation nor rights, then referred to the article Locke. In order to do away all this consequence, we are told that it is of no importance whether a matter thinks or not, for what is that to justice or injustice, to the immorality of the soul, and to all the truths of the system, whether political or religious. The reader, enjoying the equality and liberty of his reason, is left in doubt with regard to the spirituality, and no longer knows whether he should not think himself all matter, but he will decide when, under the article animal, he finds that life and animation are only physical properties of matter, and lest he should think himself debased by his resembling a plant or an animal, to console him in his fall, they will tell him, article, encyclopedia, and animal, that the only difference between certain vegetables and animals such as us is that they sleep and that we wake, that the animal that feel and that they are animal that feel not, and still further in the article animal, that the sole difference between a stock and a man is that the one ever falls, while the latter never falls. After the same manner, after pursuing these articles bona fide, the reader must be insensibly drawn into the vortex of materialism. In treating on liberty or free agency, we find the same artifice. When they treat of it directly, they will say, take away liberty, all human nature is overthrown, and there will be no trace of order in society. Recumbents will be ridiculous, and chastisement unjust. The ruin of liberty carries with it that of all order and of police, and legitimates the most monstrous crimes. So notorious a doctrine is not to be debated in the school, but punished by the magistrates. O liberty, they exclaim, O liberty, gift of heaven, O liberty of action, O liberty of thoughts! Thou alone art capable of great things, see articles, authority, and preliminary discourse. But the article chance, fortuit, all this liberty of action and of thought is only a power that cannot be exercised, that cannot be known by actual exercise, and Diderot in the article evidence, pretending to support liberty, will very properly say this concentration of cause and effect supposed by the philosophers in order to form ideas representing the mechanisms of the universe is as fabulous as the Tritons and the Naiads. But both he and D'Alembert will descant again on that concantation, and returning to chance, fortuit, will tell us that thought it is imperceptible, that it is not less real, that it connects all things in nature, and that all events depend on it, just as the wheels of the watch, as to their motion, depends on each other, that from the first moment of our existence we are by no means masters of our motions, that were there a thousand worlds similar to this, simultaneously existing and governed by the same laws, everything in them would be alone in the same way, and that man, in virtue of these same laws, would perform at the same instance of time, that the same actions in each one of these worlds. This will naturally convince the uninformed reader of the chimera of such a liberty or free agency which cannot be exercised. Not content with this, Diderot in the article Fatality, after a long dissertation on this concantation of causes ends by saying that it cannot be contested either in the physical or in the moral and intellectual world. Then what becomes of the liberty without which there no longer exists just or unjust, obligation or rights? These examples will suffice to convince the reader of the truth of what we have asserted. As to the artful policy with which the encyclopedia had been digested, they will show with the cunning its authors sought to spread principles of atheism, materialism, and fatalism, in short, to plant every error incompatible with that religion for which at their outset they professed so great a reverence. And that is chapter 4 of Barruel's Memoirs illustrating the history of Jacobinism. If you have enjoyed this reading and want to see more like it, please consider subscribing. It would be greatly appreciated.